Yat Shakedos Shea Roderick began She Aro Twenty Original being between a bushes chin Kia an a dash trade dos sit na Jenny a dash another do Telana Eade Nasha. I'm one of the assistant attorney generals here with the Navajo Nation Department of Justice. And this week, for the month of February, we've been doing a series of presentations on chapter matters, various chapter topics. And this week, we have the topic, and I have a presentation here, why the Local Governance Act needs to be amended. And I felt like this could be a two-part presentation because I've done this presentation before, and sometimes it takes 4 hours to do. And so, um, you know, I also talk about four different models of local governance amendments that I'm recommending, and doing that over a 4 hour period, and trying to condense that within these lunch and learn series. I felt like, maybe we could try this as a two-part. And so I wanted to begin this talk and this week with why I believe the LGA, Local Governance Act, needs to be amended. And so let's get started with a brief history, if I can. Oh, good morning or good afternoon. Okay, having a little bit of technical difficulty here. Let's see, my next slide will not come up. Let's see. Let me try doing it over again. Hold on. Apologize for this. Let me try representing. Okay. I see it on the screen, but okay, then let me do this way. Okay, let's start with a brief history. Now, again, I do a 4 hour presentation talking about the whole history of our chapters, but we're going to target some key dates here. Here are three of those dates, beginning with how chapters were created originally. And so I have a slide here saying the Bureau of Indian Affairs, under the Loop Agency in 1927, created the very first chapter, which was Loop Chapter, to deal with local matters. And I covered this back in October as well, briefly. And history shows through various research and documents that by 1929, that expanded to 5 chapters in the Loop Agency, and that superintendent of that agency moved over to the Fort Defiance Agency and started creating chapters as well. And so these chapters started popping up all over the reservation. And in 1933, you have council, Navajo Tribal Council at that time, they were called, uh, looking and wondering what are these what are these chapters. And so they created a standing committee on chapter organizations. And so so there's documentation by a tribal council resolution indicating we need to create this to start studying what these chapters are. And so, but we had after that, in the 30s and 40s, there's not much written about chapters or said about chapters. You don't really read or see anything about chapters until the mid 1950s. And so here, I titled this Council Created Chapters in 1955. And in 1955, there was a budget resolution passed by the council saying that the chapter president and the vice president and the secretary treasurer at that point in time, there were 86 chapters. We will start giving you regular stipends for 2 meetings a month. And fun fact here, stipends at that time was $12 per official per meeting. So in that same budget resolution, it officially recognized 86 chapters, which so that was automatic. And then 3 years later, there was a certification procedure indicating how more and more chapters can be created. And so the chapters needed to, if another chapter needed to be created, that community had to establish that they were an existing community, that for in the area there were already 1,000 people population in the surrounding chapters, and there needs to be a new chapter created. And then 3, they needed to show that where they're going to place their chapter house, they can have, people will have access to a chapter meeting. So that was the certification procedure. So chapters numbers that were established, number 87 to 110, they went through this certification procedure. The first 86 chapters didn't have to go through the certification procedure. So that is a fun fact. And the next thing I want to talk about is the 1979 amendments. The advisory committee, the old advisory committee of council would pass resolutions saying, whether it's this is how you elect a chapter official, or there'll be minor provisions saying these are the duties and responsibilities of chapter officials. They were very, very basic. And so these various council and standing committee resolutions would make its way to Title II of the Navajo Nation Code. So all of the chapter related laws originally were in Title II, and they've started at Section 4001. And so here in 1979, there were amendments to that part of the code. And so another fun fact, by 1979, we had 104 chapters, and more duties and authorities were being given and expressed in those, whether it was a council resolution or an advisory committee resolution. And in 1979, council said, well, chapters, you can pass an ordinance, which is a local law, on any matter, but it was subject to council approval. So that's going to be something that we're going to talk about, by the end of today, about the ability of chapters at that time can create and enact a local ordinance on any matter, not just this is what you can pass ordinances on, or we're going to limit you to these topic areas. Here, so long as council agrees with your local ordinance, your chapter can pass a local law. Under this 1979 amendments, this is the first time we see a clear expression that the chapter president directs and supervises chapter personnel. Okay, and then also a clear expression that chapter officers, they define the policies, the chapter policies. And then also chapter officials supervise chapter accounts. The chapter officials are the ones who purchase equipment and supplies. And so here, what I'm trying to communicate and highlight is the chapter officials were doing it all. They were being elected officials. They were at the chapter level doing the administrative work. And then also at the same, another fun fact, 1979 is the first time you get the expression that, we have a 25-member quorum. So no matter how big and no matter how small your chapter is, you need 25 people at your chapter meeting in order to have a quorum. And so that's 1979. We move on to a year later, we have a standard plan of operation. And from this document, we get even more and more clarifications and expressions about what does the chapter president do? What does the vice president do? And what does the secretary treasurer do? And so, as highlighted there, if you did a side-by-side comparison, you looked at the standard plan of operation and you compare it to Title 26 today, many of those same provisions carried over into the Local Governance Act. And so that's another key thing to think about and hold on to your thoughts about. Okay, we had this 1980 plan of operation. A lot of provisions made it into the LGA. What's significant about that? And we'll talk about that. Other chapter authorities appropriating funds. This is all 104 chapters can do that. They can decide when and where and to hold a chapter meeting. Here, also chapter officials, they had an express duty to certify chapter resolutions. So at the, you have a title to a resolution, the whereas clauses, now therefore resolved. And then there's we considered this at a duly called chapter meeting with a vote of this in favor, this opposed, and this amount abstaining. And then there's a certification. We as chapter officials certify that this resolution is accurate. We had a duly meeting, we had a quorum, and this is the official vote. So that certification requirement was expressly stated in 1980. Fun fact, we don't have that anymore. We don't have any certification, express certification clause, law or policy today. So why it wasn't carried over from 1980, I don't know. But a lot of what's stated in 1980 did carry over into the Local Governance Act. Okay, so now we're moving to 1984. And there was a separation of duties. And what I mean by that is that chapter officials, you're no longer running everything. We're going to place a chapter manager in each of the chapters. And this chapter manager program is going to be housed under the Division of Community Development. The goal and purpose of this is to provide some professionals to the chapters to handle their funds and handle their personnel, also decide how to handle their chapter properties, how chapters deal with procurement and records management. At that time, they didn't call it 5 management system, but that's essentially what they were getting at. And here, there was no single person supervising the chapter manager. The chapter manager simply reported to all chapter officials and all of the council delegates. So that's going to become important as another reasons why we need to amend the LGA. And then in 1991, council delegates become the primary supervisors over the community service coordinator. And so when this happened, one of the things that, some of you may remember is that in '89, there was the riot, and then there was a change from the chairmanship over to the 3-branch government. And when this happened, they were talking about separation of powers, checks and balances. They created a Office of Navajo Government Development, and they placed a 3-branch government as a temporary system. And the Office of Navajo Government Development was going to create a more permanent government structure for the Navajo Nation. And so with that in mind, you have in 1991 the Community Service Coordinator program replacing the Chapter Manager program. In doing so, that program, the old program that was under the executive branch of the Navajo Nation, now goes and falls under the legislative branch. Why? Because the council delegates are under the legislative branch. The Division of Community Development is in the executive branch, right? So here, very similarly to the chapter manager program, the community service coordinator has to implement, the management systems, 5 management systems. They finally give it a name. These are the 5 management systems for fiscal, handling money, property, chapter buildings, chapter equipment, personnel, procurement, record keeping. And so, under this, this will become important as council delegates become supervisors, that they can delegate their supervision responsibilities to the chapter official. But the key thing to think about here is that the primary supervisors for the CSC at that time was the council delegates. And if there were more than one council delegate, then they decide amongst themselves who would be the primary supervisor over the CSC. One other thing that I wanted to mention is at this time it was very clear that in the early 90s that the CSC administered short-term employment, like PEP workers, JTPA, TAPP. So, and I was a former chapter summer youth employee, so I know they administered that as well in the early 90s. Okay, so we're going to move from 1991 to 1995. But let me see if I can answer any questions. Some of these are pretty specific. And so let me, if you can focus your questions about the presentation, I would appreciate it. Some of these more specific questions, if you could email those to me privately, I would appreciate it. Okay, so moving on to the LGA, the first version of the Local Governance Act comes from 1995. The Office of Navajo Government Development is doing studies. They're reaching out into the communities, and they prepare a memo. And this memo is several pages long. It maybe a half an inch, 3/4 of an inch. There's a lot of papers in that memo with several exhibits, and and when you read that memo, Office of Navajo Government Development is saying that we're reaching out to the elders, we're reaching out to individuals, and they make a strong recommendation that the central government needs to stop dictating to them. Meaning, Winter Rock needs to stop dictating to chapters. And so with that, we get this proposal for home rule. And if I have a little bit of time at the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about what home rule is outside the Navajo Nation. But basically, this referendum proposal that we want, the Office of Navajo Government Development is saying, we want the Navajo people to vote on this. We want to introduce the commission manager form of government. And we want the chapters to decide at the local level, do you want to stay under the 3 chapter official system, or would you like to create a commission, and the commission can consist of 5 to 12 elected members? And if you do that, you'll have a chapter legislature that, they are the ones responsible for voting for chapter policies, creating those policies, and they would basically be voting. We would no longer need a 25-member quorum. It would just be a quorum of the elected members. And then we would have a manager who would be the CEO, so to speak, and they would be appointed by the commission. And similar to how home rule municipalities operate outside of Navajo Nation, those home rule chapters would have all legislative, executive, and judicial powers. The only ones that they would not have would be those legislative, executive, judicial powers that are given somewhere else by a general Navajo Nation law, or as provided in the chapter charter, creating the home rule. So those are the only two areas that would limit a chapter's ability to exercise those powers. So, in other words, the chapters are getting a lot of power. They would be able to get a lot of power from council. And on top of that, if council or Winter wants to create and limit the chapter's power that they already have, 2/3 of the chapters need to ratify. They need to agree to Winter amendment. And so again, this is another strong push for, not allowing Winter to change rules and policies on chapters. So some examples in the memo that when you read it, what are some of the home rule powers? So chapters, you can contract. You have full ability to contract. You will have full ability to impose taxes. You can regulate businesses. You can grant interest in land, which, oil leases, gas leases, mineral leases. You can acquire property rights from Navajo members on or off the reservation. You can hire your own attorneys. You can adopt ordinances. You no longer need council pre-approval. You can, as long as consistent with Navajo Nation law, you can do that. Approve franchise to businesses, issue business licenses, and establish public utilities. Borrow money, pledging money as security for loans. You can bar non-Navajos from the community if they violate chapter laws. Chapters can exercise eminent domain. I mean, there's so much more of the powers, planned powers in the document, but those are some of the things that they were talking about at the time. Chapters should have these powers. It shouldn't be at the Winter level. And so how can, so this is the grand plan. The first grand plan. How would we able to do this? How would the referendum work? And how would, if passed, how would chapters be able to gain home rule status? Well, at the chapter level, there would need to be a petition signed by 35% of the registered voters of the chapter. The election administration would verify the petition, and then the chapter would create a charter, and also name the whether you have 5 or whether you had 12 initial commissioners, that those would be named, and then your charter would be reviewed by the Office of Navajo Government Development, the Controller, and the Department of Justice. And so, again, this was a plan of the times. And ultimately, the chapter would have an election in order to become a home rule municipality, home rule chapter. However, this was proposed and brought before at a council session, and obviously council or Window Rock, some elected leaders in Window Rock felt that that's giving chapters way too much power. And so they asked, council asked the Office of Navajo Government Development, go back to the drawing board. You know, council actually has a lot of these authorities, basically insinuating that, you know, it's Window Rock that delegates these authorities. It's not like that, you know, chapters should be automatically given these authorities. So go back to the drawing board and give us a different version of the Local Governance Act. So it takes essentially another 2 years, 96, 97, and then into 98. We finally get a version of the LGA enacted on April 20th, 1998. All right. So when you look at the LGA today, here's a bird's eye view. You'll see that there is a combination of actions that council or the advisory committee has taken since 1958, and they sprinkled in some of the suggestions from the 1995 memorandum for home rule. So, for example, number one, section 1 talks about, okay, chapters from now on, you're going to have an executive side of the chapter consisting of your chapter administration. They will execute the policy of the chapter created by the legislative side of the chapter. The legislative chapter will be the chapter officials plus the quorum of registered chapter members who create the policies. So, and all of this is going to be done under separation of powers and checks and balances. So you get that from section 1. Section 3 talks about chapter certification procedures. By 1998, you had 109 chapters. And no, I'm sorry, 1989, you had 109, 1990 to 91, you finally get the 110th chapter. And so at this time, we have 110 chapters. If we're going to have more than 110, we're going to resort to the old 1958 certification procedures. You got to have a community. You got to have the surrounding chapters have more than 1,000 people, creating the need to create another chapter. And and you have to have access to, you know, the chapter meeting for your chapter houses. And so that law was changed, you know, very minorly from 1958, but it's basically the same. Section 101 to 103, the certification procedure. Chapter has to create a file management system, has to be certified by the, it has to be reviewed by the Auditor General. The Auditor General then recommends that to the RDC, and the RDC certifies, and then they can become governance certified. So that's the procedure talked about in section 103. It also lists kind of like and I always describe it as the pot of gold. Section 103 is the pot of gold. chapters, if you get your file management system certified and you get your land use plan, there's a pot of gold in section 103D as in David and E as in Edward. Those two will outline all the authorities that you will gain as a governance certified chapter. So there was an incentive basically to have chapters create their own file management system and have their land use plan approved. Section 1001, as I stated earlier, a lot of the duties and responsibilities from the 1980 plan of operation, they essentially copy paste. We like this duty, we'll transfer it over here. And one of the things that is important to mention here is that in 1995, when they were proposing the home rule, the memo also talks about the idea that a lot of those 1980 duties that were given to chapters, they're really administrative. And so it was basically questioning, should chapter officials have administrative duties? And so they gave examples like supervising employees. That's more administrative and managerial, managing financial affairs, co-signing checks. Those seem administrative, not necessarily legislative. Another example was the Secretary Treasurer duties. In 1980, they were responsible for maintaining accounting systems, keeping records, and maintaining chapter property. Those also seem to be administrative. That's what they're saying in 1995. However, the final version of the LGA kept much of those administrative type of duties, responsibilities, and even though Section 1 says, duties of separation of powers, checks and balances. So, so that sometimes creates some inconsistencies when I'm advising chapters. Is this an administrative duty that should be handled by the CSC, AMS, or chapter manager, AA, or do we follow the law? For example, vice president has a duty to monitor chapter community projects under the law, but then the plan of operation for the CSCs and the chapter managers under the file management system, that duty is given to the chapter manager, CSC. So, so those are the types of inconsistencies that I think that were recognized originally in 1995. So I'm not saying anything new. I'm just, providing this information that there's a lot of things that were identified in 95, a lot of problems. The other thing I'll talk about here is eminent domain. That was kept as, that was a carryover from the suggestion from the Home Rule Charter proposal. All right, let's move on. One of the things that I always do in these types of presentation is talk about Exhibit G to the Local Governance Act law that was passed. So you have all these exhibits to legislations that are passed, and I, often quote from what this says, because this is council saying to the entire world that we are the governing body of the Navajo Nation. Whatever was proposed and under home rule, that chapters would have all judicial, executive, and judicial powers, except, unless expressly delegate or withheld under a general law, or or withheld by charter. That's not how we're operating here on Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation Council has the power, and we got that power in 1989. We are the governing body, and so we delegate authority to everyone. We delegate to you chapters all of these authorities, and so that's the theory behind why it complete, it's almost like a complete 180. You go from home rule, where chapter have all the power, to the 1998 LGA, where council is saying we are the governing body. You have the power that we say you do. You don't have any additional power until we say so, is basically what this says. And then the other thing too, that's another fun fact, DOJ didn't say that chapters are a fourth branch, or we didn't say that they are not under DCD or council or under the courts. This is what leadership said back in 1998. So under Title II, Section 1, there's a clause in there that says chapter official, the Navajo Nation government. We consist of the executive, the legislative, and judicial branch. That's the Navajo Nation government. But then in 1998, they added the underline. The Navajo Nation government consists of those three branches plus political subdivisions, which are not under any branch of the central government. And so this also is very interesting. And it always begs the question, are they under DCD rule? No. Are they under the council delegates rule? No. This is what they said back in 98. And so sometimes this provision, again, breeds inconsistencies in terms of trying to define where they go for guidance, where they go for instructions. And so that's our law today: 3-branch government plus political subdivisions. And if you look at Title 26, political subdivisions are defined as the chapters of the Navajo Nation. Okay, let's move on to, all right. So if you go to if we were to go back in time, 1998, with the original goals, chapters create a 5-management system. We've been telling you since the 80s. Now we're giving you an incentive. We're taking away some of those powers that you had. Now you got to create a 5-management system in order to gain all of those back. Plus, if you wanted to administer land, not only do you need your 5-management system approved, you need to also have your land use plan certified. So that's the original goal. And another thing, again, I talked about earlier was Section 103 powers, D as in David and E as in Edward. Those are where you list all of the powers that you gain. So if you're listing powers that you're going to gain, that means all chapters start out not having those powers. So if chapters can't acquire, sell, and lease chapter property, how can they rent office space or chapter buildings to Navajo Nation governmental entities like Daltex and others? And so at DOJ, we had to create an intra-governmental office space use agreement because all chapters, whether you're government certified or not, they do rent these properties. And so we had to make legal accommodations without amending the LGA. If a government certified chapter is the contract, that means if you're not government certified, you can't contract. Contracting with other chapters, a lot of chapters have regionalized in terms of creating regional government councils, and in those regional councils, they want to have certain agreements and understandings about how they can all benefit from one another. Well, that's going to require a contract with a chapter between chapters. But if that's a governance certified power, then it limits what non-LGA certified chapters within that regional council can do. And so, again, you can read the slide yourselves. This, it creates these distinctions of what some chapters can do and cannot do based on their LGA certification status. Also notice that previously all chapters could adopt any ordinance subject only to council approval. But here, ordinance power now becomes only a government certified chapter power. So that's what I'm talking about. They took away some things, some powers that chapters originally had, and placed those as incentives to become governance certified. And in terms of supervision, another fun fact comes from Exhibit G. Okay, so there was a discussion in early 1998, and this is at the old former Transportation Community Development Committee of the Navajo Nation Council. And the discussion was, should we give supervision back to chapter officials? And they said no. Remember, in 91, council delegates became supervisors. So by 1998, when this law was proposed, council delegates were still supervisors. And so the discussion was, should we give that back to chapter officials? Answer, no. We're going to retain supervision. And not only that, we're going to say in section 1001E of the LGA that chapter officials are prohibited in the management and operation of the chapter administration. So they went even further than that. And so when I'm presenting this, I go back to this. What is the purpose, the original purpose of the LGA? We're going to clearly define the executive and legislative functions. And we're going to do this under the separation of powers and checks and balances. And my question now always is, does it do that? If you read it today, would you be able to see what were executive and what are legislative functions? My thought is no. And so, uh, and one of the reasons and things that I highlight, one of the reasons for suggesting, that the LGA needs to change is we have a law. Again, Section 1001E, chapter officials shall be prohibited in the management and operation of the chapter administration. But yet, a year later, there's a change of mind. Chapter officials regain supervision. We're going to transfer the CSC program under the old Local Governance Support Center program, LGSC. The CSCs and AMSs, they are now executive branch employees. There's going to be general administrative direction by the program, but then the chapter officials are going to become direct local supervisors at the local level. And they decide amongst themselves who that person will be. And was Section 1001E amended to provide for this? No, it was not. And so, I was a part of the whole decentralization task force. I came back to DOJ, and that was one of my duties, is to be part of the task force to see how the LGSC can be replaced by the ASC. We created plan of operation, and that's one of the things I talked about. Hey, Section 1001E was never amended or deleted, and so we should get rid of direct local supervision. We did that, but then it was reinstated 4 years later for various reasons. And so, and just over a year ago, and at the end of 2022, the plan of operation for the ASC was amended again to say that, okay, chapter officials, you can become direct local supervisors as a delegated authority if and when you receive trainings on personnel. So that's how it reads today. And so that's the various ways we have been dealing with supervision of local staff from 1999 until now. All right. So another thing too to talk about, in terms of reasons to amend the LGA is we've been treating different chapters differently. And here's some examples. In terms of personnel, under, if you're not LGA certified, then again, AMSs and CSCs, they are executive branch employees. The ASC are their primary supervisors. They can, chapter official can get delegated authority. The CSCs and AMSs are under the personnel policies manual. And they're not subject to any of the 5 management system templates. But if you're governance certified, you can have different personnel policies depending on when you were governance certified. So the original 5 have their own unique personnel policies. In 2007, we created a template for all 5 management systems. So some chapters followed that. Some chapters followed the 2010 template. And then on top of that, none of these templates talk about alternative forms of government, AFOGs. So some chapters that are LGA certified, they became an AFOG, and their personnel policies don't account for the appointed chief executive of their chapter. And so needless to say, there's a lot of holes that we need to address. Here's another fun fact is that, the original goal of the LGA was to say, okay, chapters, you need to create a fiscal policy and have that certified. And then we can start dishing out money to you chapters. Well, the council did a complete 180 in 1999. and gave, I'm sorry, that was 1998. That's a typo. I'm sorry. 1998, independent grant of authority. 5 months after they passed the LGA, council gives an independent grant of authority and says, despite what we said in the LGA, we're going to recognize the prior authorities that we've given the chapters to spend on PEP, housing discretionary, handle chapter stipends. But Budget and Finance Committee passes a resolution and says, here's how we're going to do that. We're going to issue funding at chapters on a quarterly basis. You need to prove to us, chapters, that you can handle those fiscal responsibilities. But today, we don't do that. We issue the full funding for the entire fiscal year outright. And so those are, that's one huge reason to amend the LGA. PEP, you need a certified personnel policy in order to handle personnel. Well, chapters, you always handle PEP, summer youth. You can still handle those, even though you don't have a certified personnel policy in place. In 2001, here's another fiscal. We're going to officially recognize that chapters can handle housing discretionary funds. And then a year later, in 2002, here's how chapters, you were going to officially recognize that you can spend your sales tax, and here's the do's and don'ts. So whether you're governance certified or not, whether you have a certified fiscal policy in place, you can start handling these funds. All right. So, and then we can even go further than that in terms of fiscal and records, and how different chapters, if you're LGA certified or not. If you're LGA certified, non-LGA certified, there's 65 today, right? There's 65 non-LGA certified. They have to use the 2010 template fiscal management system and records management system. They need to do that because in 2010, the Attorney General of the nomination issued a legal opinion saying, okay, chapters, since you don't have a fiscal policy in place yet, for many of you chapters, we're going to allow you to utilize the template. So only these two templates. You still need to use the other laws and policies, but for fiscal and records, you can use a template. And then on the governance certified side, there's 5 chapters that had created their own fiscal policy and records management policy. They can use that. Some chapters, again, adopted the 2007 template, and then 35 approximately adopted the 2010 5 management system for fiscal and records. Let's move on to procurement. If you're not LGA certified, you follow Title 12 of the Navajo Nation Code, the Procurement Act, and you're going to follow the procurement regulations. Newsflash, those are, the Procurement Act was recently amended, and hopefully soon we'll have brand new procurement regulations. So those chapters will be following that versus governance certified chapters that have the same 3 different versions of what they follow. And today, less than half of the chapters are governance certified. And there was a history. I wanted to talk about the history a little bit, but I'm running out of time. However, what I will say is that when I joined DOJ in 2005, there was only 5 chapters, and there was a directive saying, DOJ, DCD, you need to streamline the process. And so how do we do that? We create help to create the template 5 management system. and there was a 5-Management System Act in 2007. That never became law, but yet some chapters gained governance certification using that template. Again, I talked about earlier that in 2010, there was an AG opinion that was issued saying, here's a template chapters. You can use this to certify as a governance certified chapters. Only 35 additional chapters gained certification under that. And so today we only have 45 out of 110 that are LGA certified. There have been efforts, this is not the only effort to try to amend the LGA. And, in 2011, 2012, there was a draft Local Empowerment Act. And so here, if you read some of the bullet points here, these were the goals of that effort. And from my perspective, it was giving some authorities, but it was also very paternalistic in terms of we need to review before you start exercising these powers. We need to review it at the Winter level before you gain these powers. And so obviously in 2016, there was a referendum proposal for regionalization. That would have been chapter reform because we were changing from 110 chapters to 24 regional governments. I was also on that task force. That referendum proposal was ultimately vetoed by the Navajo Nation president. And so the Navajo people never got a chance to talk about regionalization. And I wanted to end this talk about, as a precursor to next week, like I said, a lot of chapters that are governance certified have adopted an alternative form of government. And there are 3 general types, and chapters can actually create their own alternative form of government. But here's the 3 versions. And in all 3 versions, you have a legislative side, whether that's a chapter council, the commission, or the council of Nada. And then on the other side, the executive side, you had the president, the manager, or the this day executive, and that's a separation of power system. The executive is appointed. And I want you all to keep that in mind for next week, because I'll be focusing on why collectively, when we go and I talk about the history of how chapters were developed, how we've evolved, how we've kept some systems, how we didn't keep some systems or some laws, and how some of that help shape how we operate as chapters today. And so it's a bit of a mishmash, but so next week what I'll be talking about is how can we reconcile some of this? How can we help fix what's happening at the local level? There's always talking about transparency. We need more transparency. We need more voice. How can, working within the laws as we have today, how can we fix it? Also, we can talk about regionalization too. If you want to just completely change the chapter system, I saw some of the comments there that, they would support a complete change. That's fine too. But we already tried it in 2016. So whether we go regionalization or some other system, which is chapter reform, or whether you like or dislike any of the 4 models I talk about next week, we got to change. Both can happen at the same time too. It's not one or the other, in my opinion, because we need to fix what we've been doing for the past 26 years under the original LGA. It's not as effective. It's not as incentivized anymore. A lot of chapters are just saying, LGA, we don't want to become governance certified. we're fine where we're at. Well, in order to combat that, maybe we should fix it. And so, again, I hope you tune in next week. And, I'll talk about, from my perspective, how we, 4 different models, how we could possibly fix our chapters out there without chapter reform. Again, if you want chapter reform, great. I'll jump on that bandwagon too if the people want it. But for now, help me help chapters from the legal perspective. And in those 4 models, those hopefully will show you, I've thought about this a lot, and hopefully Navajo leadership will adopt it, and the people will understand it. And so see you all next week.